In my opinion, anybody working with children should be child protection trained, should have some kind of background, because you absolutely never know. And certainly, having worked as a child protection social worker, we did not just work with working class families from a poor background. Like, this is not what that's about. It's about the fact that anybody, any child, simply by nature of the fact that they are a child, is at risk of abuse. So my name's Liz Wilson, and I am the director of an NGO in Peru called SKIP, Supporting Kids in Peru. In my former life, I was a social worker. I'm a fully qualified social worker, and I worked in England for a number of years as a child protection worker, doing sort of individual case investigations for children in terms of abuse. And I also managed a housing project for young people. So I've got quite a lot of child protection experience, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Save the Children defines child protection as measures and structures to prevent and respond to abuse, neglect, exploitation and violence affecting children. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at what we're going to do if we detect child abuse, and also how can we work to prevent child abuse. So it's understanding what child protection means. This is what we're going to look at in the session. What child protection means practically to NGOs, and how can you, as an NGO director, if you are, how can you, as someone who works in an NGO, if that relates to you, work within your organisation to ensure the safety of children. We're also going to consider the cultural and the legal context, because that's going to be different for all of us, because we're all working in different countries, which means one thing, one strategy that you might use in one country may be completely inappropriate in another. And obviously the legal definitions are also going to be different, and that's something that we will look at. It means the law that you're working under, the powers that you have if you, for example, detect that a child might be being abused, that's going to be different depending on where you're working. And we're thinking, particularly in terms of differences, but also about your organisation. So your institutional objective, the responsibility your organisation has, the role that it has, the cultural context of where you're working, the legal framework that controls how you work, and also the type of volunteers that you're working with. Obviously, the training that I do, if I've got a group coming in for 10 days, is not as intensive as if I'm training a group of volunteers that are going to be with us for a year, because it's just not practical. So that also has a big impact, and also in terms of how much contact possibly they're going to have with children. Although myself, I do the same training for everybody, because I think whether or not you're working in another team and you're just around the children a lot, or you're someone that's directly involved, you should all work from the same hymn sheet, you should all have the same base of training. I really think every organisation needs to give significant thought to the fact that any training you're going to give to volunteers about child protection is going to be highly ineffective if you as an organisation don't have a policy and a procedure for responding to incidents of child abuse. When I first got to SKIP, we didn't have one either, and I Googled writing a child protection policy for international NGOs, and lo and behold, would you believe, there is a document that is entitled that very thing, written. I know, I was amazed. I was like, you are kidding. It's like a 20-page booklet. It's absolutely awesome, and it's written by Save the Children. So anybody, and I get an extra gold star, because I was like, oh, I'll tell people, I'll send it to them, and then I realised this morning I posted it on Omprakash quite some time ago, so I hope I get an extra star for posting my information on Omprakash. But I think everything's on there, including the training that I normally do for volunteers. I'm pretty sure I've posted all of it. And just to emphasise, why is this necessary? I get a lot of volunteers who say to me, oh yeah, when I always ask volunteers, have you done child protection training before? And they're kind of like, no, I haven't worked with those kinds of kids. And I'm like, oh, what, the abused kind? It's not actually that easy to tell which the abused kind of kids are all the time. Like any of you managing NGOs, let me tell you, 2 organisations do I know of. I've worked in both. One was a live-in orphanage. Imagine their horror when somebody felt a bit dodgy about a guy that was working in there and Googled his name, and lo and behold, he's an escaped paedophile from Spain that is now living in their orphanage, and that's a 100% true story. It took them 20 days to arrest that man, and he was living in the orphanage the whole time with the children. So So this does happen. 2 years ago, we had an application from a man who wanted to do football with our kids. And somebody had actually already arranged for him to come and watch the children because he was going to put them in his sports group. And I was kind of like, hang on a minute, we don't know who he is. Like, we're going to give these children to him. We need to make sure, same as we would do with any volunteer, that this guy is a safe person to be with kids. We delayed it because we were doing an application form. Then we always do reference checks on people. And while we were doing that, it came out that he's a convicted paedophile and he's been deported from the US in order to avoid jail time. And that's something that all of you need to be aware of when you're working in South and Central America, I imagine other countries as well. In order to avoid jail time, people who are from South America, I assume Central as well, can elect to be deported. Okay, so they don't go to prison, they receive absolutely no rehabilitation whatsoever, and they are free once they get back here to do whatever they want. So we need to be really, even particularly more careful about who we are taking on, who we receive applications from. So again, this isn't about creating a feeling of fear, terror and suspicion and walking away from this feeling petrified to take on any volunteer ever, but it is about doing fair and reasonable checks on people to make sure that they are safe. And then if you are the manager, this is how I feel about it very much. If anything ever happens in my organisation, and obviously please don't let that ever happen, but if it ever does, I walk away from that feeling that I did absolutely everything that I possibly could to make sure that these children were safe. And that's the best that any of you can do. If someone abuses a child, it is not your responsibility because you haven't done that to that child, but it is your responsibility to make sure that you did all you could to keep them safe. And I think that's how I get on with the job and that's how I deal with it. Okay, so when we talk about child abuse, what are we actually talking about? Does anyone know the category names?
Like neglect.
Right, neglect, yeah. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal, yeah, which is like emotional abuse. And there's one more which I include, domestic abuse. And I include domestic abuse not only because of the risk that's posed to children in terms of physical injury because they're caught up in fights between parents. There was a really serious case in the UK, I think last year, where a dad went to punch the mother and he missed and she was holding the baby and he punched the baby. So there's a serious risk to children posed in domestic abuse, not only because of that, but also because of the emotional impact of witnessing and experiencing the two people that you care about the most in the world fighting with each other. Okay, how would you define that category of abuse? How would you describe it? And what would you expect to see if you were working with a child who had experienced that kind of abuse? The signs of physical abuse are very obvious. There will be marks, there will be cuts, there might be bites, there will be bruising. So you will be able to see. If you see that a child's been injured and you ask them kind of, what happened, Timmy? And Timmy goes, oh, I fell off my bike and it was really rubbish and I cut my arm and it really hurt. That seems like a fair disclosure. If you try and talk to Timmy and he looks really upset and awkward and he tries to run away and he pulls his sleeve down and he doesn't want to talk to you, or if it's a bruise in a really strange place, you know, if it's like on their back or something and you see it that might be a bit stranger and they don't really have a story, then that's when you might start getting concerned about how did this injury actually happen, because normally children are quite happy to talk to you about how they cut themselves. Normally in the training in my own organisation, I will talk about what will you do if a child comes to you and tells you that they've been hit. I don't know about you guys, but in our organisation it does happen quite a lot. Not all the time, but it does happen fairly regularly. And I set up very clearly here the process that people should go to if a child tells them within our organisation that they've been hit by a parent or whoever it is. Interestingly, I realised the other day that I didn't say specifically what they should do if they witnessed it in a school, and so when two of our volunteers saw a teacher hit a child around the face, surprisingly, they didn't actually do anything about it. I'm not saying they should have jumped in at the time and screamed at the teacher. I actually think that would have been inappropriate. But they didn't make a formal disclosure because of some of this cultural legal stuff where they were like, oh, it's probably all right. And this is something very natural that we all do, actually. When we see abuse, when we see something that doesn't fit with our picture of the world as we want it to be, one thing that lots of people do is they close off to that, or they provide excuses for, like, it's probably legal, it's probably okay, it's probably an all right thing that happens here. And they use that as a justification for not making a disclosure about what they'd seen. Okay, emotional abuse. Yeah, shouting, screaming, name-calling. It's stuff that makes children feel really rubbish about themselves, and it's very, very damaging to their self-esteem and their confidence. And I mean, the thing is, what we'll see with all these categories really is that the indicators in terms of how children might react are very different, and that all comes down to something that we call resilience. So yes, children might be very aggressive, they might also be very withdrawn. Emotional abuse is extremely difficult to prove. In fact, you will almost never take a child, you'll never make a court case out of the fact that a family is emotionally abusing their child, because the only person that can really tell you about it usually is their sort of 5, 6, whatever-year-old child. It's very, very difficult to get that evidence into court. So you're much more likely to go with something like physical abuse because of this. I would guess emotional abuse probably is present in most cases of child abuse, actually. Sexual abuse. Some of the associated behaviours with sexual abuse can be very, very extreme. We're talking about really any kind of sexually inappropriate exposure towards children, which can also involve things like pornography. We had a really weird case where they've been showing their children fairy porn. I didn't even know that existed. But so there can be some really unusual ways of kind of exposing children to sexual activity that may not actually involve having sex with them. In terms of the behaviours that you'll see, certainly children can display over-sexualised behaviour, and that can be, you know, some things like publicly masturbating at an age where you would not expect to see that. I mean, you wouldn't expect to see it at all. But obviously little boys will fiddle with their willies, so that you need to kind of distinguish between what is a concerning sexual act and what is a boy fiddling with his willy, because we can't kind of rush in to investigate concerns about sexual abuse every time that happens, or we'll be spending a lot of time investigating abuse. One of the other kind of outcomes of that is that children can have very poor self-care skills. And I've certainly worked with children like this where they stop cleaning themselves, they stop washing themselves, and that's also a very strong indicator of abuse. In terms of a teaching point with this stuff around sexual abuse, it's something that can make people feel a lot more awkward. And they don't like using the language around it either. So I'll get reports of kind of like, he was doing something with his thing, and you're kind of like, what does that actually mean? Like, come on, we need to be very specific. If he's touching his penis, I need to know it. So what I try and do when I'm doing this training at this point is use as many sexual words as possible, so that if someone needs to come to me and say, a child tried to put a penis-shaped object in my mouth, they can actually do that because it's kind of been desensitized, like they feel comfortable using those words. Not just about the language, but also so that in that moment, if they do see something, they've heard that that can happen, and they're more prepared to see what they're actually witnessing. Okay, yeah, neglect in younger children is a lot easier to detect because they don't have developed self-care skills. So if you have a 5-year-old that's being neglected, they're much more likely to kind of come up looking very scruffy and grubby than a 14-year-old who is now able to take care of themselves. I think neglect is a really key one for us to all recognise. Would you look at the threshold of neglect the same in the United States or England as you would do in a developing country? No. Obviously, if you live in a house where you don't have running water and you don't have a cement floor and you don't have a washing machine, you don't have a whole host of other things that facilitate easily bathing your child, and you may only be able to wash your child once a week, that's not about neglect. That's not about neglectful parents who are not taking care of their children. That's about living in poverty, in absolute poverty much of the time. So I think for me, when I'm training volunteers, I talk at this point a little bit just about being realistic about how difficult and challenging it is for parents to get their kids kind of up and dressed and ready. I point out that personally, I think they're incredibly well dressed, particularly when they go to school. They're immaculate. And I honestly think it's phenomenal, and I have no idea how they manage to get their school uniforms looking so incredibly clean every day. and hopefully control a little bit some of those comments that I've heard, which I sometimes find a bit offensive, about how smelly and dirty and grubby the kids are, because it annoys me, but also I think it's actually kind of offensive if people aren't thinking about where those kids come from. Okay, just remember, with domestic abuse, it isn't just about violence, it's also about arguments, shouting, screaming, which may not culminate in an actual physical argument, and actually it's still detrimental and damaging and upsetting to your child. So yeah, just kind of remembering that abusive nature of arguments as well. In terms of abuse, what makes children vulnerable to abuse? I'm thinking particularly in terms of social factors. Innocence, definitely. So they're vulnerable because of their age. Single parent families and stepfathers as well, particularly in terms of sexual abuse. There's a lot of research that shows that children living in step-parent families are a lot more likely to be sexually abused, because somebody is a lot more likely to abuse a child which is not their biological child. Overcrowding in houses. One of the things we hear all the time, mums telling us about stories of when they've been abused. They started sharing a bed when they were 7 years old with their 15-year-old cousin. Happens all the time. And you've just got lots and lots of people all sharing 1 or 2 rooms in a house, and lots of people sharing beds, and it just means that the access is there. Drug and alcohol abuse, absolutely. History of abuse, absolutely. We know that this is a cycle that perpetuates. We know that in families where children have been raised with abuse going on, that they are more likely to end up having children in families where abuse also goes on. Absolutely, disability, and that can be both of children or of parents. Other social factors, and sort of overriding thing is poverty. And poverty, why, how? We've talked about house sharing. You live in a dangerous area where the police don't come, where nobody's really monitoring what's going on, where there's a lack of home security. A lot of the mums have talked about husbands coming back really drunk. They don't want to let them in the house, but if they lock the door, the husbands climb over the wall because they haven't got a roof and get in the house that way. So it means that you're really, really vulnerable. And that's not just husbands who can get into the house that way, it's anybody. Also, a lack of education, limited social services. So when you're talking about the cycle of abuse, there actually isn't anybody coming in there and intervening to work with people who've been abused in order to try and break that cycle for when they have children themselves. What does this mean for the community that we are working with? It means that our kids are at extremely high risk of abuse. And this isn't about, as I said, saying that only children in these environments are abused, but it is about saying that children who live in these environments are at exceptionally high risk of being abused. And we are very aware, certainly where I am working, that the child abuse rates are staggering. This training is so important. I do it at the beginning when people start working with us, because the kids are gorgeous and they come in and they are very, very loving, and they want to give everyone a hug, and they're absolutely lovely, and everybody forgets that this reality is going on behind. It's not about treating them differently, but it is about remembering that for some of these children, there's some really heavy stuff going on at home. And so for 2 reasons. Firstly, because if anything rises to the surface and that child starts trying to tell people that they are being abused, then we want to know about it. And secondly, for a little bit of empathy when the child is causing absolute merry hell in your class and will not do what you're asking them to do and is being a complete pain, so that people can kind of sit there and just remind themselves that for a lot of these kids, when they go home, their lives, they're pretty tough, you know? And I hope that that helps volunteers. The other thing that I always say to people as well during this training, and another kind of cautionary tale for all of you, what we've had happen before, is this is not about everybody becoming the super detective of child abuse. I don't want to know every single individual possible case of child abuse that's going on in our organisation, because nobody can deal with it. The point is responding if children need to talk about it. That is important. If the children are coping with it, they have their own coping strategies, they are dealing with it, we are not going to go blundering in there and start trying to figure out, play detective and find out what is going on in their families. We have to be realistic about the system that we're working in, social services, and the reality that if these children make a full disclosure, not even that so much, but really the alternative for these children is that they go and live in a children's home, and that's the only strategy that they have in Peru for dealing with abuse. Literally, they do no work, they do no preventative work with children at all in terms of keeping them in families and working with them. Social services will only get involved once children have been removed from the home. So it's a totally different way of dealing with this stuff, and we have to be really confident if we're going to make a formal disclosure that actually the situation for that child is going to be better for them to be living in an enormous warehouse with 100 other kids in a children's home. And obviously I'm well aware that that makes them hideously vulnerable to a whole load of other things and susceptible. So if we're going to do that, I need to know that really that's the better option. In terms of cultural differences, so what I think about is kind of where do most of our volunteers come from, what are their expectations, and then try and match some of the training points in with things that they are going to see which they may find distressing or which they may not understand or which they need to be aware about, really. And so just to bring it to the domestic abuse setting in Peru, there's a high level of domestic abuse in families. There's an expectation in many communities that men will physically assault their partners, and it's not about being aggressive or violent, it's about teaching your woman how she should behave. And if you don't do that, then actually you're a bad husband because you're not teaching her well. So that means that the whole concept of domestic abuse in many communities there is completely shifted. That's obviously not to say that we support or accept those actions, but it means that support for women is very limited, and understanding in the community that this is something that shouldn't be happening is also lacking. So it's something that we kind of continue to work on and continue to work with the families on, but it's to kind of help gain insight for people who are coming to the project. I talk to the volunteers about our belief system in terms of child protection. So we do not believe that physical castigation of children or smacking is appropriate. I'm well aware other people might feel differently, but that's the way that we work. So I put that out there right at the beginning so everybody kind of understands that we're singing from the same hymn sheet. That's where we're coming from. We don't smack children. The reality of working in Peru, I once again point out, is that children will be smacked. And again, this is about preparing people that kids might talk about being smacked. That information needs to be referred through the appropriate channels, and we will deal with it. But again, we're not going to kind of leap in there and start doing a huge investigation. If a child has been smacked, we will deal with it. Legal definitions. In this section, you need to highlight anything that might be very different to where people are living in their everyday lives. So that might be stuff like here, physical punishment in schools is legal, for example, in your case. What I sometimes let people aware of in Peru, for example, sexual abuse, the legal definition is only if there's been penile penetration. So it means that it's extremely difficult to prosecute on a basis of sexual abuse in Peru. And in terms of skip reporting procedures, I then talk to volunteers about specifically what they should do if they have a concern, which sets up a clear structure for the fact that if they're worried about something, the appropriate thing to do is go and talk. We have managers for each individual team. So each person knows who their boss is, and they know that they can go and talk to them. We also have child protection, like responsible people, child protection officers. We have 2, simply because of the language barrier. So I do for English speakers, which isn't that helpful anymore, actually, because I'm not there for about 4 months a year. Probably ought to think about that. And then we have a Spanish social worker who is the person for Spanish people. But really, everybody knows that they just go to their manager. So we also talk just a little bit about appropriate disclosures and then confidentiality in terms of not sharing that information with everybody else that you're working with, because it's not relevant for everybody to know that. In SKIP, we track serious cases. We have, because we have somewhat of a social work role, really, with the families that we're working with. So we actually have a meeting every week where we track the cases that we're really worried about with the kind of key leaders from each team. And that's where we would make decisions about whether or not we're going to report something on. But it depends whether or not that's appropriate in your individual organisations. So at the end of all the talking, I ask everybody who they would talk to if they had concerns about a child, just to make sure finally and forever that people are clear about what they should do. And then I just describe this thing that we have in our child protection policy, actually, which is a really simple thing that I thought you guys could implement, depending on where you're working, but is the rule of 2s. And the rule of 2s is super simple. And I find it a really useful way to just get people safe practicing and really make sure that kind of everyone's protected. Don't be on your own with the children if possible. And if you're kind of like, I don't know, there are some people, like the psychologist was like, that's a little bit difficult for me. And I was like, yeah, okay. But then it's about making sure if you are in a closed off space, the windows are open, you have a door with a window in it so that people can see in, you leave the door open. And certainly in terms of our office, I make it absolutely clear to people that you should never be in there on your own with a child. And this protects not only the children, because we're just making sure there's safe practice going on and no one has the opportunity to abuse a child. And if you see someone in the office and they're on their own with a child, you're like, hang on a minute, what's going on? That's a really clear rule that we have, that nobody does that. But also it protects us as workers, that if a child, you know, children who are sexually abused can make false disclosures about being sexually abused. So it means if that happens, that you can say, well, you know, Steve was with me, it's fine. So you've always got that kind of backup of there being somebody else there with you. If possible, it should be an adult, but I would make sure there's someone else with you. And if there isn't a grown-up, then I would take a child. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll throw that open to questions and we'll go from there. Okay, children hitting other children is, I mean, we have the same thing, that our kids in Skip are super aggressive. They're constantly, and it's almost in this way that, because everything's really aggressive at home, it's like, how do you show that you really love someone? You run up to them and you smack them on the back really hard and you're like, all right, mate, and then they cry and it's like, yeah. It's this really curious thing. We've done some stuff, we used, I don't know if anyone's used Second Step in their schools. We tried that. It was a bit difficult though. Second Step, it's a violence reduction program. It costs kind of a bit of money. I might be able to scan it in and send you what we have. We could only afford one, and it's for like 6th grade, so then we had to try and adapt it, and it sort of didn't work very well for the ones that weren't the grade. But it's a series of kind of lessons with photos and lots of chats about, like, why is Jamie sad? He's sad because Timmy smacked him on the head. Was that nice of Timmy to do that? And just kind of talking about feelings and emotions and how do you want to be treated? So kind of treating it in a more global sense rather than individually. We have a psychologist, so if we've got really aggressive, violent kids, we kind of refer them on for a group stuff, sort of talk about their feelings and why are they so very angry. In the moment, I guess, whatever kind of strategy that you guys use for managing it. But yeah, it becomes a child protection issue more if it's other things that they are doing, and then that can be really difficult. It's about keeping an eye on those kids, I guess. Okay, well I think the first thing to say is I wouldn't teach it differently if I was talking to men unless they particularly asked me to focus on anything, because obviously safe practice is just about safe practice. So I can't think of anything specific. I would encourage everybody to practice in the same way, not naive to the fact that some people might feel more vulnerable. You might feel more vulnerable because you're male, but I think as long as everyone's got the same safe practice, then that means that you're practicing in an appropriate way. Do you know what I mean? In terms of that specific problem, I think that's difficult, and the only thing I could think of is doing some kind of gender stuff in the class, which we've tried to do quite unsuccessfully, I think, in terms of kind of like, you know, people being boys and girls, but that not necessarily meaning that you have to behave in a certain way. But the kids are pretty fixed in some of their thinking on that stuff, so it can be difficult. But I would kind of talk about, maybe just do a session on sort of what is a boy, what is a girl, and tease out some of these preconceived ideas that they have about what that means. Do you know what I mean? So you can maybe challenge their stereotypes about men, which will then lead on to them hopefully being able to communicate with you better.